Mr. President, we gather on the floor of the Senate at an unusually early hour. In fact, the Senate has been in session all night. The question before us is the nomination of Betsy Devos to be Secretary of Education, possibly the most controversial nomination made by our new President Trump. This is an office which doesn't usually attract this kind of controversy. Former Secretaries of Education have included Arne Duncan, who ran the Chicago public school system and was the first to be appointed in the first term of President Obama. Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who is a friend of mine and I've served with before his service in the Senate, was also the Secretary of Education. The choice is usually one that is bipartisan and largely supported by not only teachers, but parents and administrators and education officials from across the United States. In this case, though, we have in Betsy Devos of Michigan, a person of some controversy. Last Saturday, I spoke to the Illinois Education Association, a group of about 150 teachers who had gathered in Springfield, Illinois. They're my friends for many, many years, and Cinda Klickna, who is the president of the organization, we have a relationship that goes back to the days when she was a classroom teacher. And she now has risen through the ranks and heads up one of the major teachers organizations in our state. Cinda is a true teacher at heart and really cares for students, cares for schools. She's devoted her life to it. She brought together 150 of her best teachers from around the state, preparing them to become more active politically in our state and nation. Naturally, they were tuned into this nomination of Betsy Devos. They have a lot on their minds these days with the selection of the new president. Nearly all of them had written me, sent me an email, or contacted me personally opposing the nomination of Betsy Devos. I've not met Betsy Devos. We tried to set up our schedules so I could, but it didn't work. I would take as much blame as necessary for that not happening. But I have studied her background. I've paid close attention to what she has said since she has been nominated and tried to understand where she comes from. It is true that she is a person of wealth. The Prince family, which she was born into, is well known in the Midwest and in Michigan for its success in the automotive industry and many other endeavors. And then she married into the Amway family, another legendary business where she's been able to accumulate some money. There's nothing wrong with that in America. In fact, many people aspire to it and reach that goal and are admired for reaching it. So it doesn't disqualify her for anything in life as far as I'm concerned, but it does not necessarily qualify her for certain things in life. It's not clear to me from her record when it comes to the field of education that she is prepared to serve this nation as our next Secretary of Education. I don't find in her background the qualifications for the job that I found when the presiding officer was chosen as Secretary of Education, or when my friend Arne Duncan of Chicago, whom I had breakfast with yesterday, was chosen for the same position. Ms. Devos' experience in education is limited to using her family's substantial wealth to push for a so-called reform agenda in her home state of Michigan. Ms. Devos has never been a teacher. She has never been an administrator. In fact, she's never held any job in public education. Neither she nor her children have attended public school. That is not a disqualification. I attended Catholic schools. My children attended both. She's never been a professor or a college president. She's never had anything to do with financial aid, as I understand it. She's never been involved in a loan program, least of all one as large and complex as the Department of Education's direct loan program. She's never taken out a federal student loan, nor have her children. Now, admittedly, that's not a requirement to be a nominee to be Secretary of Education to have had any of these experiences. But had she had even one or two of these, we could point to real-life experiences which would prepare her for this awesome administrative responsibility. I think these gaps in her life experience are fair to raise when a nominee to be the nation's top authority in education has shown a lack of familiarity with even basic educational policy issues, as Ms. Devos did in her testimony before the Senate Help Committee. She could not articulate the difference between proficiency and growth in the context of K through 12 accountability. I can tell you that Saturday at the Illinois Education Association meeting, everyone in the room knew those terms well, and they knew the central role that they had played in the national debate on education since the election of President George W. Bush and the creation of No Child Left Behind. Ms. Devos also said in her testimony that states should be able to decide whether to enforce the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. She apparently didn't know that IDEA is already a federal law and has been for more than 40 years. As a nominee, Ms. Devos did not do her homework. Is that the person we want as Secretary of Education? The experience Ms. Devos has is limited to using her considerable wealth in favor of an agenda for so-called school choice. Ms. Devos has spent years supporting school vouchers, which funnel taxpayers' money from public schools into private schools. I am familiar with that program as it was started here in the District of Columbia years ago. It actually started with an amendment in the Appropriation Committee by a friend of mine. Mike DeWine was the senator from Ohio and offered an amendment to create a voucher program in the District of Columbia. It was a surprise because a markup of the Senate Appropriations Committee is not usually the place where you tackle something of that moment. But he offered it, and I offered some amendments. The notion behind it was that the District of Columbia would provide vouchers for the parents of children so that they could choose the schools for their kids. They wouldn't be forced to attend public schools. They might not attend charter schools. They might choose instead to use their voucher to send their kids to a private school. I offered 3 amendments that day in the Appropriations Committee. The fate of those amendments told a pretty graphic story about the voucher program in the District of Columbia, and it also reflects on the candidacy of Betsy Devos to be Secretary of Education. The 3 amendments were, number 1, that the teachers in the voucher schools had to have college degrees. That to me did not sound like a radical idea. Most of us assume that if you're going to teach in a school, you have a college diploma. Well, it turns out my amendment was rejected with the DC voucher program that day when it was offered. And the argument was made they needed more flexibility in terms of who would teach in these schools. That was worrisome. The second amendment I offered said that the schools themselves, the students, had to take the same test, achievement test, as students in public schools in DC so that we could measure one against the other. That amendment was also rejected. They wanted to have the right in these so-called voucher schools to have their own set of tests that they would approve, not necessarily the same test as the kids in public schools. The third amendment I was sure would pass, but it failed as well. And the third amendment said the actual school buildings used for DC voucher schools had to pass the fire safety code requirements of the District of Columbia, and that was defeated too. I voted against the DC voucher program for that reason. I couldn't understand how you could push for a voucher program not guaranteeing that the teachers had diplomas from colleges, that they had school and safe buildings, and that the students would be tested against the same public school test that DC public school students faced. That raised questions in my mind about the true intent and motive of those who were pushing voucher schools. Ms. Devos in Michigan has been a proponent of voucher schools. She's pushed the expansion of charter schools and used her extraordinary wealth to insulate them from common sense oversight and accountability in her state. Even as these schools failed to deliver on the promises made to children and parents, Ms. DeVos continued to protect them from the same accountability standards as public schools. In 2015, a federal review found, quote, an unreasonably high, close quote, percentage of charter schools on the list of Michigan's lowest performing schools. Today, for-profit companies operate almost 80% of charters in Michigan, more than any other state, and are underperforming compared to public school counterparts. Let me be clear. I believe some charter schools can be effective. I have visited so many schools in my state, public schools, Catholic schools, charter schools, every imaginable school. I've supported high-performing, successful charter programs. I think about the KIPP program here in the District of Columbia, in Chicago and other places, consistently producing some of the highest results, the best results, and the highest standards for students. Is there a lesson to be learned from the KIPP model for all schools? Of course there is, and you'd have to be blind to ignore it. But on average, charter schools don't perform any better than public schools on average. And to say that this is a model which we should embrace regardless is unfair to students. If we are going to exalt performance and results, let's do it in an honest fashion. Now, these schools which receive federal and state taxpayer funding should be held accountable as all schools. Ms. DeVos doesn't agree. Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia, at the hearing, asked Ms. DeVos at her confirmation hearing if she agreed with equal accountability for any K-12 school that receives taxpayer funding, whether that school is public, charter, or private. She refused to agree and at one point even said no. Ms. DeVos also seems unwilling to acknowledge that many private and charter schools are not equipped to support students with disabilities and other special needs in the way that public schools are required to do. These students, along with many low-income and minority students, would certainly be left behind in Ms. DeVos' ideal education world. Last year, and the presiding officer was a major part of this decision, Congress did what seemed unimaginable. We came together and passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. ESSA makes important improvements to our elementary and secondary education program. It requires states to set academic standards, measure student achievement, develop accountability plans for all schools receiving federal money. Giving Illinois parents, teachers, and principals a replacement to No Child Left Behind was a great bipartisan achievement, and I do want to call out in a favorable way my colleague, the presiding officer, Senator Alexander of Tennessee, and my colleague, Senator Murray of the state of Washington. They did a great job. While ESSA provides more authority to states and local school districts, it also included important federal guardrails to ensure key civil rights protections and hold states and school districts accountable. But federal rules to carry out that important federal task are now in doubt and in jeopardy. I don't have confidence that Secretary DeVos will appropriately carry out the federal government's responsibility under the law to ensure that all students, regardless of income, race, gender, or disability, are achieving. For me, it all boils down to this. I do not believe Ms. Betsy DeVos will keep the promise we made more than 50 years ago when Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, which guaranteed in the United States of America a free and equal quality public education to every child. I'm not going to give up on that promise, which really is a bedrock principle of America. There's more work to do, I'm sure, but I believe that we can improve America's public schools. Let me also say, I couldn't disagree more with what Mrs. DeVos has said about guns in schools. My colleague, Senator Chris Murphy, represents the state of Connecticut. Both he and Senator Blumenthal have told us many times in heartbreaking and graphic detail what happened that day at Sandy Hook Elementary. what they went through just as observers, what they saw in the eyes of the parents who came to realize that their children had been killed, brutally killed in their classroom at that elementary school. And I've had the responsibility to meet with the parents of those kids and to try to make some sense out of a tragedy which is just nonsensical. Ms. DeVos was asked by Senator Murphy about guns in schools. Ms. DeVos refused to commit to opposing efforts to repeal. She said she would not commit to opposing efforts to repeal federal law making schools gun-free zones. She went on with a hard-to-explain explanation about grizzly bears and why schools may need guns to ward off grizzly bears. That kind of statement is reckless and dangerous. We should expect more of someone who wants to be our nation's top education authority.